Good morning, Dr. Perry.
Good morning.
Now, you're talking not just to the audience that you see in front of you here, but you'll be talking to others who will be watching online. I imagine quite a number probably from Scotland. So that's the audience that you have. You will start your evidence once Mary has administered the oath, and then Ms. Richards will ask you the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Please state your full name.
Robert John Perry.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Dr. Perry, you have a degree in chemistry awarded in 1971 and a PhD in chemistry 1975, is that right?
That's correct.
You're also an accredited qualified person. What does that mean in practice?
The qualified person status, it effectively applies to, I think, probably all the pharmaceutical industry, that there was a requirement to have in any pharmaceutical enterprise somebody who was authorized and qualified to release batches of product for clinical use.
Can you just give an outline of the nature of the work you undertook between 1975 and 1981, so before you joined the PFC?
1975, I just finished my PhD and I did a little bit of teaching during that. From my recollection, I joined a water authority in Wolverhampton, or close to Wolverhampton, where I was an analyst in the laboratory. And after that, I moved on after about 18 months to become the chief analyst at an organisation called the Regional Sterile Supply Unit in Wolverhampton, which was a fairly large-scale manufacturing organisation for producing sterile fluids and topical fluids for use in the West Midlands Regional Health Authority health service.
And was that the job you were doing immediately prior to moving to PFC?
It was, yes.
So you joined the PFC in 1981 as Quality Control Inspector.
Yep.
And I'll ask you in a few minutes a little more about that. And then in 1985, you became the acting director of the PFC. And then in 1985, the director of the PFC, a post you remained in until 2003.
I think it was 1984 that I became the acting director of PFC.
Sorry, that's what I meant to say, yes.
Sorry, yes. Otherwise, that's correct.
2003 to 4, you were seconded to the role of personnel director for SNBTS.
Yes. Yeah.
And then between May 2004 and May 2005, you were director of pharmaceutical and technical projects for National Services Scotland.
That's right.
In a sentence, what did that entail?
I think there were a large number, as indeed throughout the health service, of small regional pharmacies making special products that weren't available commercially, and there was a view that perhaps could and should be centralised into a single organisation. So I was asked to do a feasibility study, which I carried out on behalf of National Services Scotland.
June 2015 to January 2007, you were director of SNBTS's Better Blood Transfusion Programme.
Yes.
And we'll come on to that towards the end of your evidence, Dr. Perry, so I won't ask you anything further about that at this stage. And then since that time, as I understand it, you've been a self-employed consultant and working with the International Plasma Fractionation Association.
That's correct.
What is that association? What does it do?
The International Plasma Fractionation Association was an organisation. It started out as the European Plasma Fractionation Association in 1991. And it was I guess the best way to describe it, it was a trade association established following the regulatory development in Europe that plasma products had to be were to be regulated by the European Medicines Agency, as it was then. And the European Medicines Agency fairly soon on, early on in this development, stated that they didn't want to speak individually to the not-for-profit, all the not-for-profit organisations in Europe. And so there was a requirement to create an effective and efficient interface between the not-for-profit fractionators in Europe with the European Medicines Agency.
And what kind of work has your work as a consultant involved over the last decade or so?
I think it's been involved. It's been involved primarily with the European. I did a little bit of work with the WHO at one stage, but I think the majority of my work has been involved in developing documents, position statements, supporting the members of the International Plasma Fractionation Association, it's an international organisation and it has members in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, and Europe, and so on. So it's been a general role in supporting the activities of that organisation.
And does that association's membership include pharmaceutical companies, commercial fractionators?
No, it doesn't. It's an association. There is a comparable organisation that was established around about the same time as EPFA was established, and that's called the Plasma Products Therapeutics Association, PPTA.
Now, during your career with SNBTS, you were involved with a range of committees and working groups, which you've listed in your statement. For present purposes, I'm just going to mention 3 of them. You were part of the SNBTS Directors Committee once you became director of the PFC, is that right?
That's correct.
And so that would have involved, amongst other things, attending regular meetings with SNBTS directors?
Yes.
And with Dr. Cash?
Yes.
You were a member of the biological subcommittee of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines from 1986 to 1990, is that right?
That's correct.
You took over, in fact, from Mr. Watt, who'd been on the committee previously.
Mr. Watt retired from the SNBTS or resigned from the SNBTS in early 1984, but I think he continued his membership of CSM for a short period after that, but then I think there was a view that it would be useful to have somebody from the Fractionation Centre in Scotland to provide expert input into the decisions of the biological subcommittee. So I was appointed to that committee.
And you were a member of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood from its inception?
That's correct.
I think at one point your statement suggests that was 1991, but in fact, and we'll come to the minutes and its decision-making at a later stage of your evidence. In fact, it's 1989.
Okay, thank you.
And when that became the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissue for Transplantation, you remained on that committee?
Yes, I basically just transferred over to the new committee. The membership changed, but I remained on it. Yeah.
And that was until around 2004, is that right?
That's correct.
And we'll certainly come back to the decision-making of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood at a later stage. Now, you provided multiple written statements to the Penrose inquiry. I'm going to read, for the benefit of the transcript, the references to the main statements you provided, some but not all of which are listed in your witness statement. That, Dr. Perry, is not because we're going to look at them all, but it's for the benefit of others so that there is collected in a single place all the relevant reference numbers for your principal statements. So it's PRSC 0001823 on the topic of high-risk donors, PRSC 0003755 on the topic of AIDS, PRSC 0003769, which relates to the infected PFC batch and the investigation undertaken into that in late 1984, PRSC 0002178, which looks at issues relating to AIDS and viral inactivation to 1985. PRSC 0001258, viral inactivation 1985 to 87. PRSC 0000145, hepatitis C screening. PRSC 0002320, use of concentrates in, I think it's 85 to 87. PRSC 0002938, recall of unheated factor 9, issue of heated factor 9. PRSC 0001919, that's a joint statement with Dr. Robert Dr Cuthbertson and Dr Foster on conditions at Liberton in the 80s. PRSC 0002620 on package inserts and non-A non-B hepatitis. PRSC 0003806, which concerns communications with Montagnier, and PRSC 0004392, which contains comments on the issue of self-sufficiency. I think you also contributed to a number of joint or corporate statements on behalf of SNBTS in the Penrose inquiry. I'm not proposing to list those. And then you gave oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry on the 24th of March 2011, PRSC 0006011, on the question again of high-risk donors and particularly prison donors. 13th of May 2011, PRSC 0006025 on the topic of self-sufficiency. 24th of June 2011, PRSC 0006038 on the implicated PFC batch. 13th of September 2011, PRSC 0006045. That was topic B3, which temporarily escapes me what that was. 28th of October 2011, PRSC 0006058. That's about viral inactivation. 23rd of November 2011, PRSC 0006068, hepatitis C testing. And the 7th of December 2011, PRSC 0006074 on the issue of 8Y and Z8. And I list those so that nobody else has to go through the exercise of pulling them together. You've told us in your statement you didn't give evidence to any other inquiries or investigations. Is that right?
I think that's correct, yeah.
So you didn't give evidence to the Lindsay or Archer inquiries. Does that mean you weren't involved in providing evidence on behalf of SNBTS to the Scottish Executive investigation?
I think I was involved in it, but I think that role, which was basically a lot of data collection and submission to the Scottish Executive, was undertaken by Dr. Foster. But I would have been involved at some level, yeah.
And then can we just look briefly at one document? It's one I'll come back to later, but it's PRSE 0001885. This is a letter from you to Professor Cash, 14th of March 1988. And if we look at the text of the letter, it's SNBTS response to HIV contamination of blood products. Further to your request for details of SNBTS actions in response to the emergence of AIDS, I've now assembled the enclosed summary of key events. There's much supportive documentation of these events should this become necessary. And if we just go over the page, as I say, I'll come back to some of the detail of it. But we can see there's a chronological narrative and a thematic narrative set out. If we just go back to the first page, please, Sally. Can you recall what the purpose of this was? Why you'd been asked by Professor Cash to pull this information together?
No, I can't recall a specific event or a specific issue that Professor Cash raised, but it was not unusual for him to write spontaneously, and because he had something in mind to ask for a summary of what happened during this important period. I don't think there was anything specific happened in March 1988 that triggered this, other than Professor Cash just seeking a summary of the events and what PFC in particular did in response to those events.
We know that there was around this time a piece of litigation ongoing, which we in the inquiry have been referring to as the HIV haemophilia litigation. Okay. Do you know whether it was in relation to that at all? It
might have been. I've just noted in the annotation to go with the litigation papers, so it may well have been triggered by that.
But you didn't have any direct involvement yourself with litigation at the time?
No, I don't recall having any detailed involvement.
So can we then come back to your work at the PFC, starting with your role as Quality Control Inspector? What did that entail?
The role of Quality Control Inspector, it was a curious title actually for the job, but it was a post that was established I think primarily as a response to the medicines inspector's report, which had taken the medicines inspector visit and their quite detailed inspection of the facilities and the arrangements at PFC, which took place in 1979, 1980. And I think there was a view that the organisation needed to hire somebody with experience in the field, not in biologicals manufacture, but in the principles and the practice of good manufacturing practice. And I'd obtained that during my work in Wolverhampton at the Sterile Supply Unit. So I was appointed really with a quite far-reaching role, which I think is why it was probably called Quality Control Inspector. I had responsible for, I had authority in all parts of the organisation, because the principle is that everything that happens in a pharmaceutical manufacturing organisation can have an impact on product quality and product safety.
And what in practice did that entail? In a typical week in 1982, what would your work have involved?
In 1982, I think it was still fairly on in my career with SMBTS. I think my priorities at that time were establishing more robust documentation systems, creating a portfolio of standard operating procedures which didn't exist when I arrived. It involved an examination of the facilities and their compliance with good manufacturing practice, and basically examining the comments and the criticisms that were made by the medicines inspectors and beginning to formulate a response to that.
If we can just look at a short extract from one part of your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry. Sally, it's PRSE 0006011, please. If we go to page 93, and pick it up at line 9, your evidence had started, just for the benefit of anyone following on page 89, we can see you were being asked about your work, and you explain at line 9 to 11 you had no prior experience of blood or plasma products. This was a completely new area of endeavour for me. And if we go to page 102, please, top of the page, lines 4 to 6, you say, I had no knowledge of the plasma fractionation industry or blood establishments or blood transfusion services prior to my emigration to Scotland. So blood fractionation, blood transfusion was something completely new to you when you took up your first post at the PFC?
Absolutely, yes.
Were you provided with any kind of training? You told us yours was effectively a new post, so you weren't taking over an inherited role. Did you receive any training or education or assistance in understanding more about fractionation and transfusion?
I don't think there was anything that you could describe as a formal training program. I think it was, as was typical of the time, it was very much on-the-job training. Mr. Watt, who was my boss, was very open. He was very generous. I think to an extent he applied the sort of deep immersion technique, and from a very early stage he allowed me or asked me to go and deputise for him at national meetings, at local meetings with the Haemophilia Centres Directors Organisation, and also made every effort to ensure that I could attend international meetings and national meetings associated with plasma products. So although there was no formal training, he was very active in exposing me to all the issues.
And then, as we established a few minutes ago, you became director, first acting director, then director, after Mr. Watt left. Now, as I understand it, Mr. Watt tendered his resignation in around the middle of 1983.
That's correct.
And then left in December 1983.
Yes.
Did you have any understanding? First of all, was that unexpected?
No, he had tendered his resignation. I think his original plan was to leave a little later, but for reasons I don't think were ever disclosed to me or others, he left certainly significantly earlier than was originally anticipated. I think it was meant to be maybe the middle of 1984, but it turns out he left at the end of 1983.
And so you were, was it unexpected then being asked to step up to the role of acting director?
Well, I had, even though I'd only been in the organisation 2 or 3 years by that time, I saw it as a good opportunity. I was enthusiastic about the work of the PFC, and I applied for the job of director when the shortlisting and took place for that role. So I think the Common Services Agency and Professor Cash and others involved thought, well, this is somebody that could perhaps take on the role of acting director until the substantive replacement for Mr. Watt had taken place. So I readily accepted that offer.
We've heard some evidence of a less than harmonious relationship between Mr. Watt and Dr. Lane. Do you have any understanding or recollection of what the relationship had been between Mr. Watt and Dr. Cash?
They were both powerful, strong personalities. Mr. Watt was very innovative, and Professor Cash was a very strong leader in those issues that he felt were important. And I guess the combination of that meant that they didn't always see eye to eye on every issue, but I honestly can't recall any major conflict that caused any disruption to the delivery of services.
Now, as director, what was essentially your role? What did you do as director of the PFC? I was appointed to be responsible for all the activities of PFC, the operational activities primarily. I was an operational manager for the Plasma Fractionation Centre, which was the manufacturing unit of the SMBTS. And you were accountable to Dr. Cash, was that right?
No, I was accountable to, again, a slightly curious arrangement, but not untypical of its time. I was responsible to the Committee of Management of the Common Services Agency. So my boss was a committee, but subject, and I think this was stated in my job description, subject to the duties and responsibilities of Professor Cash.
In practice, did you have much by way of interaction with the committee, the Common Services Agency?
No.
So in practice, you would be discussing key issues with Dr. Cash?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, he was the National Medical and Science. He was the National Medical Director at the time. He was very authoritative. He was a very strong leader, and I think it's fair to say that I had daily interactions with Professor Cash.
And if we just go back to one part of your oral evidence, to the Penrose inquiry, PRSE 0006011, page 94, please. From line 3, you're here describing your role and responsibilities as director. My responsibilities were effectively the operational management of the Fractionation Centre of the SNBTS. My responsibilities covered everything from financial control, operational management to production, quality control, not single-handed, obviously. I had a staff of about 200 to 250 people, and also the research and development of new plasma products that the service wanted to bring into use. Is that a fair description of your principal responsibilities?
Yes, I think that's a good description.
And then your statement tells us that from 1990, your direct accountability was to the SMBTS General Manager.
Yes, that's correct.
Did the change of management structure in 1990, did it have any particular advantages or disadvantages?
Oh, I think it was a much more coherent process as an operational manager of one of the units of SMBTS. My line management reporting and accountability was much clearer than it had been before. So I was still subject to the duties and responsibilities of the National Medical and Scientific Director, but I had a clear operational manager in the form of Mr. McIntosh.
Now, I want to ask you a little more now about the organisation of the PFC itself. If we take it from your witness statement to start with, so could we have WITN 6920001, please, Sally? And if we go to page 7, we pick it up at the bottom of the page. You explain the departmental structure of the centre. So the first department that you identify, manufacturing, responsible for all aspects of product manufacture, from bulk collection of plasma from regional transfusion centres through to, top of the next page, return of manufactured plasma products to RTCs. So that's the department that's doing the core work of the PFC, to take the plasma and turn it into blood products.
Yes, I actually think it was probably called the production department at that time, but that's a good enough title, manufacturing department. Yeah.
The next department you identify is the quality department, and this would be essentially the area of activity that you led from 1981 to 1984. Is that right? Or to the end of 84?
Yes, that's correct. I think prior to my appointment, I think the arrangements in place at PFC were more like a quality control arrangements. It had a laboratory which had a laboratory manager and manufacturing, but there was no single department or person with responsibility for quality across the whole organisation.
And we can see a short description there of the work of this department, responsible for development and enforcement of quality systems, quality control laboratory testing of products and intermediates, approval of finished products for use, and latterly regulatory compliance and product licensing following the removal of Crown immunity status. Now, just pausing there, I'll want to come on to ask you about product licensing, interaction with medicines inspectors and so on in due course. But you've said there latterly regulatory compliance and product licensing following the removal of Crown immunity status, which I think was around 1991.
Yes.
But obviously there were attempts at regulatory compliance, there were product licences in existence prior to that.
Yes.
Who had responsibility at that point?
I think that would have probably been myself when I took over in 1981. I recall Mr. Watt saying that it was very important that although we operated under Crown immunity, I don't think anyone in PFC or the wider SMBTS saw that as a satisfactory arrangement. So the PFC did make attempts, and successful attempts, to obtain product licenses from the Medicines Control Agency. It was always a moot point what the status of these licenses were, given that we were operating under Crown immunity. And a good example of that was I think during 1983, we just developed a new intravenous immunoglobulin product, and we were very anxious to establish its safety and its efficacy and its quality prior to entering into clinical trials. And I suggested that the best way of doing that would be to submit a full and comprehensive product license application for that product, which we did. I think the Medicines Control Agency, when we submitted it, were slightly bemused because they weren't quite sure what to do with it, because we were an organisation operating under Crown immunity. But there were certainly strong links that we tried to maintain with the Medicines Control Agency.
Okay. I'll ask you some more about that in due course. If we continue on this page, the next department, Research and Development, led by Dr. Foster, who obviously the inquiry heard from last week. Was the Research and Development Department essentially left to set its own priorities, get on with its own work, or was it directed from above by Mr. Watt or Dr. Cash or you?
I think probably all of those people that you've mentioned, including myself, had a very close working relationship with the R&D department. Dr. Foster was a very able leader. He was very competent. He had an excellent track record of innovation and careful work. But in terms of giving direction to the R&D department, that would certainly have come from people like Mr. Watt, Professor Cash, and Natalie, myself, when I took over as director.
So would it be right to say you might well have been involved in discussions with Dr. Foster whilst you were quality control inspector, but in terms of trying to give any steer or direction as to how the R&D department should organise itself or prioritise particular projects over another, that wouldn't really have fallen to you until 1984 onwards?
No, I would have had an awareness of what Dr. Foster was doing. We worked closely together. It was a relatively small centre, the PFC, so we had daily contact and daily conversations, I think.
And then we can take, I think, the remaining three departments rather more quickly. Engineering, so responsibility for all aspects of building, plant and equipment maintenance. Project engineering, responsible for specialist engineering support, IT, etc. And then administration and business support services. Now, you've told us in your statement, and I think heard elsewhere, that in terms of the PSC's funding, that came through the Common Services Agency.
That's correct.
You've said in your statement you don't recall funding being denied for key developments or upgrading. Would it be right to understand you're really talking there of the period from 1984 onwards when you became director? You wouldn't have had much knowledge or involvement in funding issues prior to that?
I might have had some understanding of financial issues. Mr. Watt was very open and he involved himself quite closely with his operational managers, so he might have expressed frustration or about delays in funding and so on. So, but I wouldn't have been closely involved, I don't think.
In terms of funding for research and development, was there a particular budget for that, to your knowledge?
There was not a ring-fence budget. It was part of the overall PFC operational budget. It had its own staff, who so there would have been a staffing budget for the department. But I don't think it was. But that would have been a local. So, for instance, if we wanted to bring somebody from manufacturing and put them in R&D, then that would have been a perfectly legitimate and easy thing for me or Mr. Watt to have done.
Now, if we could go to page 9 of the statement, which I think is the next page, in fact, bottom of the next page. You describe the remit of the PFC as follows in paragraph 29 of your statement. At the time of my appointment to SNBTS in 1981, the remit of PFC was to manufacture and supply a range of plasma-derived products, albumin, coagulation factor products and immunoglobulin products, as well as anticoagulant and infusion fluids. Just pausing there, we've heard about albumin, coagulation factor products, of course, and immunoglobulin. Very briefly, what's the reference to anticoagulant and infusion fluids encompass?
I think this was a project which was initiated by my predecessor, Mr. Watt, and he felt the facilities that existed at PFC were not only capable of making plasma products, but we had the ability and the expertise and the knowledge to make infusion fluids such as sodium chloride injection and just sterile aqueous solutions that are used for patient treatment, but also preparation of specialist anticoagulant solutions for use in the blood transfusion service.
And then continuing with the sentence, for the treatment of patients throughout Scotland, in the early to mid-1980s, this remit was expanded to include bulk collection of plasma from Northern Ireland Blood Service and manufacture and supply to Northern Ireland of plasma products from this plasma. And then you say in the next paragraph this, which I just wanted to ask you a little more about. It was considered, particularly by Professor Cash, an important principle that the distribution to health boards, hospitals and haemophilia centres of manufactured plasma products should only be via SNBTS and Northern Ireland Regional Transfusion Centres, which would be responsible for their onward distribution to health board hospitals and haemophilia centres. This arrangement was designed to reinforce the role of RTC medical staff for professional and operational liaison with prescribing doctors and health boards. This principle and practice was maintained throughout the period of plasma product supply from PFC. Why was it that Professor Cash in particular thought this was such an important principle?
My understanding, which was quite clear, and he was very clear on this point, and he often went to great lengths to actually reinforce it. I think his view was that everything to do with blood and plasma products was part of the umbrella term of transfusion medicine, and we had centres with consultant medics and other medical staff and scientific staff, and he felt very much that they should be involved as an interface between the manufacturer and the ultimate users of the products. So so if there was an inquiry about a particular product, that would go to the regional transfusion centre and would be fielded by either the director or a nominated medical consultant that was employed by each individual RTC.
So whatever PFC produced would be distributed by PFC to the regional transfusion centre for onward distribution by the regional transfusion centre to a haemophilia centre or to a hospital.
Absolutely, that's exactly what happened.
Which in practice, would that mean that the PFC had limited ties directly then with the clinicians who were prescribing and using its products?
Yes, I think we did have very limited, I wouldn't call it limited access, but the main route of communication on issues associated with plasma products would have always been initially via the regional transfusion centre and the nominated consultant for whatever the product was. If they felt the need to involve somebody from PFC in responding to that, then we were quite free to do that. But it was a very important principle, underscored by Professor Cash on numerous occasions. And so everything that we produced went through the regional transfusion centre.
And does it follow from that at the PFC you would have, again, a relatively limited knowledge and understanding of what the approaches to product usage were in the individual haemophilia centres or indeed the hospitals utilising your products?
Well, the arrangement I've described didn't preclude conversations between myself and haemophilia directors or anybody else in the PFC, and indeed they took place fairly frequently. So through those channels, but also through the close relationships we had with the regional transfusion centres, both the directors and the scientific and medical staff employed by them, I think we had quite a good idea of the nature of the products we made and what their purpose and use was.
And then is it right to understand that the PFC itself had no medical staff amongst its employees, apart from Dr. Cash as the overall director of the National Medical Director of SMBT?
That's correct. He was the de facto medical advisor or medical director of PFC.
Do you have any recollection as to what proportion of concentrates produced by PFC would end up being distributed to hospitals other than haemophilia centres? Or is that something you simply wouldn't know because everything went through the regional transfusion centre?
I think we knew sufficient for our purposes where the products went. We knew albumin was distributed by the regional transfusion centres to most hospitals because it's used so widely in patient care for acute emergencies and so on. We would have known where the immunoglobulin products went, and we certainly knew where the haemophilia treatment products were sent and located. And we, although, as I said, PFC was very much the wholesaler to the regional transfusion centres, we had a fairly good knowledge, geographical knowledge of where the products went and how they were used.
In relation specifically to factor 8 and factor 9 concentrates, did you have any sense of the extent to which they were being used outside of haemophilia centres? I don't mean for home treatment, I mean by hospitals other than haemophilia centres.
Coagulation factor products, I think I knew at a fairly early stage that factor VIII would only be used in a context of haemophilia. I don't think there are any other uses for factor VIII, so I think it was quite clear that that was only used for haemophilia care. Factor IX, or the factor 2, 9 and 10 product defix, I was certainly aware, and others were, that was also used for anticoagulant reversal therapy in some patients.
Did the PFC ever play any part in the ordering, selecting, storing or distributing of commercial factor concentrates?
No.
Can I then ask you a little, so we can take that down, Sally, about the facilities and the premises of the PFC when you arrived in 1981? Can you give us a brief tour of what the physical premises comprised?
From 1981?
In 1981 when you arrived, yes.
It was a facility that had been established and commissioned in 1975. It had been designed at a substantially earlier date than that. So when I arrived in 1981, it was clear that it was technically quite an advanced operation. It had this quite unique method of fractionation, the continuous small volume mixing system, which was fairly unique to Scotland, and the associated IT systems that were necessary to drive that. But otherwise, I think my early impressions, perhaps informed by the medicines inspector's report of the facility in 1979, 1980, was that there was a substantial amount of work required to bring the facilities up to modern GMP standards. And I would say that the modern GMP standards that I've defined were established after the commissioning of the PFC, and certainly well beyond the date in which the facility was designed in the late 1960s.
And is that therefore your understanding of why only 5 years into the life of the building there was this pretty critical report by the inspectors, which might have been less surprising in a building that had been in existence since the 1950s, but might at first blush be thought surprising in relation to a building that opened in 1975?
I think the facility, as it was established, in the original design, and I think Mr. Watt shared this view and his disappointment that during the phases of building and approval of funding, I think there were economies that were required to bring the cost of the facility down, and what suffered was storage facilities, general pharmaceutical manufacturing areas, but they were all cut down to a minimum size, and I think the consequence of that was that very soon, very early on, particularly as plasma supply began to increase in the 1980s, that they were found to be inadequate to meet the needs of a modern pharmaceutical facility.
If we pick matters up with the second visit from the inspectors, so a visit that took place by the time you were in post.
Yes.
So it's BNOR 40572. It's not the clearest document to read, but we can see at the top of the page, it refers to an inspectorate report on the current status at the Protein Fractionation Centre, Edinburgh, as of October the 1st, 1981. So you were in post at this point in time?
I was, yes.
And if we go over the page, we can see under the heading General Comments, so the bottom half of the page, there's reference to your appointment, and that there had been progress towards and then we miss a word, perhaps fully integrated quality assurance system, and that had been progressed. If we just go, please, to page 7 and the conclusions. Again, we can see if we pick it up under the heading conclusion at the top of the page, it says progress towards implementing necessary standards of good manufacturing practice in general quality assurance matters, including provision of standard process documents and standard operation procedures is generally acceptable. A major effort regarding those aspects is now coming to fruition. So that was the work you were focusing on in 1981.
That's right. I think that was where my initial focus was applied, because it was something that could be done without additional funding or building modifications and so on.
And then there are two major exceptions to that noted. And then 4.2 then turns to deficiencies regarding buildings and facilities. It says firm proposals to remedy those deficiencies regarding buildings and facilities as reported in the first inspection are still awaited with dates of implementation. And then paragraph 4.3, if we can just go down a tiny bit, Sally. The present buildings and facilities continue to fail to reach minimum standards of GMP, and a licence would not be recommended for an industrial equivalent unless agreed upgradings were instituted as a matter of urgency. So that would tend to suggest that the response to the first inspection had been, and I'm not suggesting this was necessarily the only thing done, but your appointment focused on the quality assurance matters, but that there were still a number of problems identified in the first inspection regarding buildings and facilities that hadn't been addressed, and that the inspectorate hadn't even had proposals for addressing. Was that your understanding?
I think that's probably right. This was October, I think you said.
October 81.
October 81.
First inspection having concluded in January 1980, so over 18 months on.
Absolutely. Well, when I arrived in 1981, I don't think there was any action being taken in response to the Medicines Inspector's report. It was the beginning of a fairly long road to get the addition, to identify the operational solutions to the criticisms, to get the funding, to create the necessary close-down periods, shutdown periods at PFC to implement these. I think by then I would have had a fairly good idea on what needed to be done, and I think there may have already been some work in progress for areas where simple changes could be made, like labelling and packaging areas and so on. But I think one of the first things I did was to improve the arrangements, but I don't think this happened in October 1981, but by that stage I will have identified the need for an automated bottle and vial dispensing sterilisation and dispensing facility, because those activities were entirely manual in 1981, and that was a clear and outstanding requirement to be rectified.
Now, we understood from Dr. Foster's evidence that the original manufacturing licence, when it came to expire in the early 1980s, was not renewed, or in the sense that a further application for a manufacturer's licence was not submitted on the basis of advice to or from SHHD in reliance upon Crown immunity.
Yes.
What's your understanding of the position and why that happened?
My understanding is similar to Dr. Foster's. I think SHHD were, at that time, I think through the chief pharmacist of SHHD, were very anxious that we didn't step outside our authority, which was granted by the Secretary of State for Scotland. So his view was that we had the authority to do what we did directly from the Secretary of State from Scotland, and there was no requirement to go through central licensing and processing systems. We thought this was an appalling idea, but it was what SHHD's position was at the time.
So is it right to understand that from the point of expiry of the first manufacturer's licence, and I'm afraid I don't have the precise date, but presumably around 1981, if it was a 5-year licence.
I think it was earlier than that. The first, the manufacturing licence.
Manufacturing licence.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
So from whatever the precise date, which I'm sure we can establish, from that point until, would it be then the early 1990s, PFC did not have a manufacturer's licence. It relied instead on Crown immunity.
I think that's correct.
In practical terms, in relation to the deficiencies that the inspectors had identified with regard to buildings and facilities. To what extent were those addressed and when?
They were addressed throughout the 1980s. It was a continuous process involving numerous refits to the organisation, which had to be done in small pieces of activity, because we couldn't afford to close the facility down for a year to do a complete rebuild and refit for the organisation. So it was a progressive requirement. And although I said I didn't think funding generally inhibited the activities of PFC, it was quite a sustained battle, I think, with SHHD and CSA to get the necessary funding at the right time. Eventually it came through, but that process probably took, and it was a continuous process and carried on through the 1980s until the early 1990s, where there was a very substantial investment in the centre to increase warehousing and various other essential buildings. And
there was a shutdown for around 3 months at the end of 1984 for building works. Was that the longest period of shutdown up until that point, or had there been earlier periods of shutdown for similar length of time?
I think there would have been earlier periods of shutdown. They may have been shorter, but they may have been around about the same time. We were able to do it in 1984 because we had such good stocks of product.
Yes, and we'll certainly be coming on to the issue of the surplus or stockpile and how that was built up and what was done with it. Just on the conditions at the PFC, if we could look at one of the written statements, please, to the Penrose inquiry on this topic, PRSE 00001919. We can see this is a statement entitled Conditions at PFC Liberton during the 1980s, and it's a joint response prepared by you, Dr. Foster, and Dr. Cuthbertson. And we can see the context of it from the first main paragraph. You had been asked, or, well, I'm not sure whether you've been asked to or whether you were addressing, because you wanted to, comments that Professor Cash had made in a letter in July 1988, which we've looked at, I think, in earlier inquiry hearings. For present purposes, can we just turn to page 3? Paragraph 1.2, where the joint response says this: since 1980, and in particular following the medicines inspection of 7980 by Mr. John Flint and Dr. John Purbs, the PFC had consistently identified, documented and communicated its concerns to the CSA and the SHHD regarding facilities and staffing arrangements at the PFC. In particular, the inescapable requirement for a major building extension in the light of anticipated major increases in plasma throughput to meet self-sufficiency targets, a wider product portfolio and increasingly complex manufacturing processes. The requirement for these developments and investments was reinforced by comments and reports from informal medicines inspectorate inspections and visits. Just pausing there, is it right to understand from the reference there in brackets to informal that although you had no manufacturing licence at PFC after the beginning of, or early in the 1980s, there was a degree of further involvement on a voluntary, informal basis?
Yes, we had quite a good and constructive and almost collegiate relationship with the inspectors, and they were certainly as enthusiastic as we were to assist in developing the facilities and fixing the problems that still existed. So I think from my memory of those years, I think we very much welcomed the continued involvement of the inspectors in our activities.
And then picking it up, between 1980 and 1987, significant improvements in investments in equipment, facilities and quality systems had been made, but on-site storage facilities remained too small, and the centre was constrained in its ability to recruit appropriately skilled and qualified staff by the rigid application of NHS Whitley Council staff employment regulations. Again, just pausing there, in what areas of the PFC's activities were you having difficulties of recruitment?
I think good examples are I think others have mentioned this as well, that, well, first of all, I think we were blessed with having people like Dr. Foster and Dr. Cuthbertson who were basically committed to the National Health Service and the work that we were doing in PFC. So we weren't looking to replace people like that. They were perfectly, well, they were more than fit for purpose, as it were. But I think in many other areas of activity of PFC, particularly employing people, skilled, trained operators who had experience within a pharmaceutical manufacturing environment, simply didn't fit the definitions of the Whitley Council prescribed, because the Whitley Council prescribed the qualifications and the experience you needed to become a medical laboratory scientific officer, and we didn't need medical laboratory scientific officers. We needed pharmaceutical operatives and so on.
And then just continuing, by 1987, little progress had been made in gaining recognition by either the CSA or the SHHD of the need for further substantial investment at PFC. And then you go on to refer to a letter you wrote, which we can look at, I think, at a later stage if we need to, in October 1987, setting out your concerns. We'll look at the extent to which the PFC, notwithstanding the constraints described here, was able to increase production, potentially achieve self-sufficiency in domestic products for Scotland, and indeed build up a surplus, which was distributed in part, as I understand it, to BPL. But would it be right to understand, looking at this, that had there been further substantial investment in terms of both facilities and staff in the PFC, that could presumably have resulted in even more by way of production of factor concentrates and other plasma products?
I think probably the answer is yes. It would have needed a fair degree of planning and building up stocks, because one of the key underlying principles of operation of the PFC and the SMBTS was that there would be continuous supply of products from voluntary donors from Scotland. So we didn't have the option of closing down for a year and not supplying, because that would have been a failure. So I think even in an ideal world, we would have had to have done it as a progressive program of work. I think one of the main constraints was about staffing arrangements, and this was a dominant theme throughout the 1980s, because it was always envisaged that the PFC would run on a continuous basis using the continuous small volume mixing system, and to do that sensibly and to run the downstream processes following the initial fractionation, we were constrained by the requirement to shoehorn those into an 8-hour working day, and sometimes manufacturing processes don't usefully fit. So it constrained our activities. It actually constrained some of the development programs as well, because they had to be adapted to basically fit the Whitley Council employment conditions for staff working in the facility.
If we then just go to your statement to this inquiry, WITN 6920001, page 24, I just want to look briefly with you at the range of products produced by the PFC. This is specifically in relation to factor concentrate. So if we just zoom in, please, on the table. And again, just so that we understand what was and wasn't being produced. You've got there 1956 factor 8 concentrate, cone fraction 1 freeze-dried, 1966 cryoprecipitate, and then 1968 the first freeze-dried factor 9 concentrate, is that right, being produced?
Yes.
By SMBTS?
Yes.
Referred to as PPSB.
Yep.
And then 1971 we see DFIX. And is it right to understand that DFIX remained the the factor 9 concentrate then that the PFC produced over the following years.
It did, yes, that's right.
And then 1974, we have the first factor 8 concentrate being produced, is that right?
That's my understanding.
NY.
Yes.
And then NY remained the name of SNBTS's factor 8 product until we get to Z8 in the second half of the 80s.
Yes, that's correct.
And we can see that just at the top of the next page. Obviously, there was then heated.
There was heat treatment programs.
If we just go to the next page. So then we can see that the dry heated defix, so referred to as modified defix, the modified NY, and then the production of Z8, April 1987. And then I don't think I need to ask you about any of the later projects such as Liberate or HitFix. Can I then turn, so we can take that down, thank you, to ask you a little about the PFC's relationship with other organisations and bodies. So starting with the regional transfusion services in Scotland, is it right to understand the PFC was essentially an equal partner in terms of the structure of SNBTS with each of the regional transfusion services?
I think that's correct, yes. The director of PFC always sat with the other directors at the directors' meetings, the coordinating group meetings, the meetings of haemophilia centre directors, and so yes, it was a fully integrated, and I think although the nature of his work was quite different to an RTC, it was a fully integrated part of the management systems within SNBTS.
With Professor Cash as or Dr. Cash, later Professor Cash as the National Medical Director, essentially in overarching control to whom the directors of the regional transfusion services and then the director of the PFC could report.
It wasn't quite like that, and this was always a frustration for Professor Cash, and I think to an extent regional transfusion centre directors, that I think each of them were, like myself, responsible to the Committee of Management of the Common Services Agency. So in many senses they were, they had an independent, they could have operated an independent, independently of Professor Cash. In practice, they never did. And Professor Cash, I think, often expressed his concern and frustration that he didn't have this line management authority. But I think he was a highly consultative individual and sought to get agreement, and 99% of the time did get agreement with regional transfusion centre directors and the PFC director on key issues that emerged from time to time.
Now obviously, PFC's relationship with the regional transfusion services in Scotland was, as you described, it was different from the relationship between BPL in England and Wales and its relationship with the regional transfusion services of England and Wales. Were there particular advantages or disadvantages to the system in Scotland, in your mind?
Well, as it operated in certainly in the 1980s, and perhaps for the duration of my employment, it always seemed to me to be the sensible way to run an organisation. It was I think in the early 1980s, it wasn't quite a truly national service. Individual centres had some freedom to act under the direction of the medical directors for the individual regions, but for large part, 99% of the time, it did operate and function very much as a national service. And I think that provided the opportunity and the ability to develop the programs it did, and the reason, for example, in 1984, that the SNBTS had managed to develop large product stocks was the basis for that was set in the mid-1970s when Dr. Cash, as he was then, was director of the South East Scotland Blood Transfusion Centre, and he instituted a major programme to convert doctors and clinicians and surgeons to the use of packed red cells instead of whole blood. And I know it's a long distance between that and self-sufficiency, but it is the fundamental building block, or it was in the 1980s, for self-sufficiency. So those programs, he was able to, and when he became National Medical Director, he reinforced those programs, and I think was very instrumental and successful in moving Scotland into an area where it used predominantly packed red cells, and whole blood became a very rare product. And it was that created the ability for PFC to build the stocks that it did during the early 1980s.
And you, as director of PFC, Mr. Waters, your predecessor, attended regular meetings with the other SNBTS directors, is that right?
Yes.
Were they quarterly, roughly?
I think they were quarterly, or as required, there would have been ad hoc meetings called from memory, I think they were the directors' meetings, at which representatives from SHHD would attend, usually the medical officer. I think they were quarterly. I think they were more regular coordinating group meetings. And as the title suggests, the coordinating group was designed to allow the National Medical Director to coordinate and where necessary, standardise the activities of all the regional transfusion centres.
There was something called Scott Blood, which I understand to be an annual conference.
Yes.
Well, who organised that, and what kind of issues in the early 80s would it look at?
I think the genesis of the Scott Blood meeting was with the scientific staff of SNBTS felt, I think it would probably maybe as far back as in the 1970s, that it would be a good idea if they organised an annual conference or an annual meeting, probably not a conference then, but an annual meeting where all the scientists in the SNBTS throughout Scotland could get together and have basically a mini conference with the scientific and senior technical staff. And I think latterly that became a fixed activity, and it developed into so initially it was run by the scientists themselves with the blessing of Professor Cash and regional directors and so on. It subsequently turned into a sort of combined scientific meeting, but also a social gathering for SNBTS staff. It was usually held at weekends, and individuals, just to give some measure of the importance of it, I think individuals were required to pay to go to it, actually. But it was a very important annual meeting of the whole of the SNBTS team.
And then in terms of the involvement of Northern Ireland, Dr. Maurice McClelland, once the arrangement with Northern Ireland was established, he effectively joined the SNBTS directors' meetings, is that right?
Yes.
What about the relationship between the PFC and the SHHD? First of all, in practical terms, what was the nature of the relationship? How often were there interactions with the SHHD?
It varied over time. I think certainly throughout my tenure within SNBTS, there were annual meetings of the annual SNBTS and haemophilia directors group, which was very instrumental in driving forward the program for provision of haemophilia, of product for treating haemophilia. And that was always either chaired or certainly attended by senior medical staff and other officials from SHHD. From that group, a coagulation factor working party, I think it was called. This is different from Professor Cash's coagulation factor study group. This was an annual, the working party was established to take forward some of the output from the annual meeting and develop it into operational activity. And I think as I say, from during my tenure, I think it was Professor Ludlam who chaired that, and that would have also been attended by medical staff from SHHD, so they were closely appraised of what was happening within SMBTS with respect to the provision of haemophilia treatment products.
And in the course of the 1980s, who were the officials from SHHD that you recall having dealings with on PVC business?
Dr. Bert Bell, who was a great enthusiast for self-sufficiency, I recall, and I think he was partly instrumental in setting up the annual meeting of haemophilia directors and SMBTS directors. There were a number of other, Dr. Forrester, who was not associated with us for very long, but he was the SHHD person. And I think latterly throughout the 1980s, it was Dr. Keel, Dr. Aileen Keel from SHHD. There may have been others that...
And do you have any particular recollections of the relationship between SHHD, whether it's any of those individuals you've identified or others, and Dr. Cash, and whether there were any difficulties in the relationship there?
Well, there was frequent contact between Professor Cash and SHHD at a fairly senior level. And I think, in truth, they didn't always agree. There was, I think Professor Cash was always trying to drive the service forward, particularly in terms of self-sufficiency and introduction of donation testing and issues like that. And there was not often, but occasionally they had slightly. They were facing in different directions, and I think this became evident during the late 1980s, early 90s for the introduction of hepatitis C testing. So, where I think SHHD were quite clear this had to be implemented on a single date for the whole of the UK, and I think others, including Professor Cash, thought maybe that's not the way forward.
We'll certainly pick up that particular issue at a later stage of your evidence. Just more generally in relation to SHHD, can I ask you to look at PRSE 0004392? This is one of your multiple written statements to the Penrose inquiry. If we go to the second page, just want to look at the question numbered 4 towards the top of the page. You were asked the question, was it your experience that SHHD policy normally mirrored that of DHSS? And then we can see your reply. In my experience on matters relating to blood safety, product licensing and professional practices, SHHD policy mostly, if not always, reflected that of DHSS. And then you refer to the role of the Licensing Authority Committee on the Safety of Medicines and decisions taken in that capacity, applying equally to all UK territories. Now, given your experience that the SHHD policy largely or mostly reflected DHSS policy, would it follow that notwithstanding the quite regular interaction that you've described between SNBTS and SHHD, the scope for SNBTS to influence national policy in Scotland and indeed in the wider United Kingdom, or to influence matters on a national level may have been quite limited, if essentially the expectation was that SHHD would follow the DHSS's line?
Well, as my statement says, I think that is my recollection. I can't recall any situations or circumstances where SHHD took a different approach to a product safety, a blood safety issue. They were always step in step with DHSS. Where they did diverge was the policy approach to self-sufficiency throughout the 1970s and 1980s, where SHHD were always quite explicitly committed to, I think, what we would regard as the true definition of self-sufficiency, which was meeting all the needs of patients in Scotland for products from voluntary non-remunerated donors. That was the target. It wasn't to balance commercial supplies and so on. So there was a divergence of policy there. So far as influencing the UK position, I think my recollection is that the SMBTS directors and senior scientific and medical staff were quite influential in those, and there were many UK forums in which issues, particularly of blood safety and testing techniques, testing regimes, introduction of hepatitis C testing, and SMBTS were always well represented and always quite vociferous and quite influential in those meetings. So it's not correct to say that we didn't have the ability to influence. I think we did, but it would still be within a UK context.
Just before we break, you rightly observed that there were SNBTS directors on a number of national committees. The advisory committee on the virological safety of blood being obviously an example of that. You were on that.
And SACTI and the Standing Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Disease and so on. Yeah.
I mean, SACTI I think was later, 1989.
Okay.
Well, in fact, I think they were both later. But in any event,
yeah.
Is it right to understand that when you sat on those committees, you were there in as it were, a personal capacity? You were not there as a representative of SNBTS or PFC?
Oh, this is my role in respect
Yes.
of ACVSP,
Yes.
as it was to start with. And my understanding is, yes, I was there in a personal capacity. I wasn't there to represent the SNBTS, but I was only there because I had skills and experience gained whilst in the employment of SNBTS. And the same is true of my membership of the Committee of Safety of Medicines Biological Subcommittee. I was there as an individual and forbidden, for obvious reasons, to divulge anything outside of that meeting that may have occurred.
Well, we'll come back to that issue of the confidentiality of those types of meetings at a later stage. Sarah, perhaps we could take the morning break.
Yes, we'll do that and come back at 10 to 12. Now, this is the first break. Let me say to you what I say to all witnesses, either at the very beginning of their evidence or at the first break, and it's this. You're giving evidence. You must not discuss the evidence you have given, or for that matter, any evidence which you think you may later be asked to give, with anyone, whoever that anyone is. But you can talk about anything else you like.
Thank you, I understand.
10 to 12.